When we talk about Jamestown, we're not just looking at some date in a dusty history book. No, we're diving headfirst into this high-stakes, absolutely brutal story of survival. And it's a story that really marks the very beginning of a nation that is, well, incredibly complex and full of contradictions. You know, everybody knows the story of the Pilgrims, right? The Mayflower, Plymouth Rock. But what if I told you that 13 years before that, another group of English settlers started a colony that was way more dangerous, far more deadly, and you could absolutely argue much more important to what America would eventually become? Yep, this is the story of Jamestown. So let's get one thing straight. Jamestown wasn't founded on some lofty ideal like religious freedom. Not at all. This was a business venture, a high-risk, for-profit gamble by the London Company. They were desperately trying to get a foothold in the New World, especially after some pretty spectacular failures. Remember the mysterious lost colony of Roanoke? Yeah, that was them too. Okay, so after this just grueling 4-month voyage, the settlers finally sail up a river. They name it the James, in honor of their king, and the spot they picked, well, on paper, it seemed pretty smart. It was deep enough for their ships, looked easy to defend, but oh man, it turned out to be a really, really bad decision. I mean, it's like they landed in a perfect storm of awful. The site they chose was a swamp, which means mosquitoes everywhere. The water? Brackish, basically poisonous. And to top it all off, they arrived smack in the middle of a historic drought. We're talking the worst in 700 years. And the people themselves? A lot of them were these English gentlemen who had probably never done a day of hard labor in their lives. They were just completely unprepared for what was about to hit them. Somehow, the colony just kind of limped along for a couple of years. But its absolute lowest point, its rock bottom, was still on the way. You see, a devastating shipwreck was about to trigger a period of such intense horror that it earned a name, a very simple, terrifying name, the Starving Time. So picture this, going into that absolutely brutal winter, the population of Jamestown was just 214 people. 214 souls just clinging to life on the edge of this vast, unknown continent. Their entire survival depended on one thing, the next supply fleet from England. But that fleet, it never showed up. Not as planned anyway. The main ship, the flagship, was called the Sea Venture. It was carrying all the new leaders, and more importantly, the bulk of the food and supplies. Well, it got caught in a hurricane and was smashed on the reefs of Bermuda. Suddenly, the colonists back in Jamestown were completely and utterly alone. What happened next was just sheer desperation. We have historical accounts, and they've been confirmed by some really grim archaeological finds that describe this descent into total madness. The colonists ate anything they could get their hands on. Rats, snakes. They were even boiling the leather from their own shoes to try and get some kind of sustenance. And yes, the evidence for cannibalism during this period is it's undeniable and absolutely haunting. The cost was just staggering. Remember those 214 settlers who went into the winter? Only 60 of them came out alive. 60. The death toll was absolutely catastrophic. It really looked like the Jamestown experiment was over. A total failure. So, by June of 1610, the few survivors that were left, looking like skeletons, honestly, they'd had enough. They got on their ships, gave up, and abandoned the fort. They were setting sail for England, just leaving Jamestown to be swallowed by the wilderness. But then, here's the twist. It's an incredible one. As they're sailing down the James River, ready to leave forever, they run into a small boat. And it turns out, it's from a brand new English relief fleet, led by a Governor Delaware, that had just arrived. So what do? They turned their ships around. They called it the Day of Providence. Jamestown was saved literally at the last possible second. Okay, so the colony is saved from total extinction. Now the hard work really begins, trying to stabilize the place. And it's right here, during this incredibly fragile recovery, that the complicated, contradictory foundations of America, well, they were truly laid. The thing that saved the colony wasn't a person, but a plant, tobacco. A guy named John Rolfe, who was actually one of those castaways from the shipwreck on Bermuda, he introduced this new, sweeter kind of tobacco that just became a sensation back in Europe. This was the cash crop, the thing that finally made the London Company's big gamble pay off. Oh, and Rolfe's marriage to Pocahontas, that also helped create a temporary and pretty uneasy peace with the local Powhatan people. The year 1619. This is a hugely important year. It's a massive turning point. You have two things happen in Jamestown that would basically define the American story for the next 400 years. On one hand, you have the very first representative government in the New World meeting in the Jamestown Church. And at the exact same time, a ship arrives carrying the first enslaved Africans, who were then sold to the colonists. Think about that. In one place, in 1 year, you have the seeds of American democracy and the seeds of American slavery being planted right next to each other. So the colony is finally a success, right? But that success, which was driven by this just insatiable hunger for more land to grow more tobacco, well, that success led directly to the colony's next huge crisis, and eventually its downfall. Yeah, that peace that came from Pocahontas' marriage, it didn't last. The English plantations just kept expanding, relentlessly taking up more land, and eventually the Powhatans' patience just ran out. In 1622, they launched this massive, coordinated attack that completely devastated the colony. It wiped out a third of the entire English population. The shock back in England was so huge that the king just revoked the London Company's charter and made Virginia a royal colony under his direct control. Let's just put the survival story into perspective for a second, because the reality was brutal. Out of the 6,000 people who came to Virginia in its first 16 years or so, only 3,400 of them were still alive. The colony wasn't just built on tobacco, it was built on an absolutely astonishing amount of human loss. You know, Jamestown's end wasn't some big dramatic event. It was more like a series of fires. First, it was deliberately burned to the ground during this civil uprising called Bacon's Rebellion. Then, after it was rebuilt, the State House burned down again, this time by accident. At that point, everybody was just fed up. The colonial government packed up and moved the capital inland to a new place, Williamsburg. And Jamestown, the original settlement, was just abandoned. So for centuries, Jamestown just kind of faded back into the landscape. Its story became more of a myth than actual history. But now, in our time, that story is being rediscovered, and it's forcing all of us to confront its really complicated past. For the longest time, for centuries, everyone believed that the original James Fort, the actual site of the starving time, had been completely washed away by the river. The literal ground zero of English America was just gone, lost to history forever. Or so they thought. But guess what? They were wrong. In 1996, an archaeology project made this absolutely stunning discovery. They found these unmistakable stains in the soil that marked the wooden walls, the palisades, of the original 1607 fort. It had been there the whole time, just buried inches under the ground. And what they've found since then has been nothing short of revolutionary. We're talking nearly 2 million artifacts pulled from the ground. Everything from armor and weapons to, yes, the butchered bones that finally confirmed those horrific stories of cannibalism. This discovery has basically replaced all the myths with the tangible and often really grim reality of what life was actually like for those settlers. So what does it all mean? Well, Jamestown's legacy is this tangled web of contradictions. On one hand, it's this incredible story of endurance, and it's the birthplace of American self-government. But it's also the starting point for chattel slavery in America, and a brutal blueprint for colonial conquest. The thing is, all of these things are true, all at the same time. And that really brings us to the final question, doesn't it? When we look back at this tiny, desperate settlement on the James River, what are we actually seeing? Is it a story of triumph? A tragedy? Or is it something else? The complicated, messy, and painful crucible where a nation was forged?